you so much.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. And I think we can start. Łukasz, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Łukasz Marchewka, and today we are going to discuss how to scale fintech. But before we start, we have to clarify what scale means. You can scale almost everything. So you can scale company, system, product, and so on. So of course, not everyone, but you can scale a lot of stuff. And for all of them, definition is a little different, but there's a lot of common stuff there. So our idea is just grow, handle more, and not increase cost a lot. So we have to remember that question, that sentence, why we are doing that. So we want to have more, not increase cost a lot, because it will be quite important why the rest of the presentation. And a few words about myself. So I'm a software and solution architect for many, many years. I also was, and still I'm doing that. I'm a software developer, DevOps. I was, and still I am team and tech leader. Now I'm CTO of Scalac, and I have participated to over 50 projects. Why it's important? Because as you can see, I have experience from many different areas. So I'm still a technical person. I have managed teams and also companies. So I have seen many different problems in many different companies, many different projects, and now I want to share my observation. So I'm not going to discuss about something what is obvious and implemented by everyone, but something what is obvious but not implemented, and sometimes we have illusion it is there but it doesn't work completely, or about something what is too controversial, and I have discussion about that stuff many times, and so let's go to details. So let's start how we can scale our company, or so let's start with company. So the easiest approach and the most common is just hire more people, create more teams, and just allow them work on the same problem or different problems. And our expectation is with after some time, after many days, sometimes after days, sometimes after weeks or even months, they can increase velocity of your company. And it's our expectation, but we know reality, and it's not so nice because that person should be onboarded. So for a couple of days or weeks, there is no extra benefits, but we forgot about reality. So, sorry, the second one was our acceptation. We accept it can be not so good as we expect, but reality is completely different one. So for many years, our velocity just dropped down, and eventually we are not able to achieve velocity which we try to achieve, but is much lower. And why? Because we have to pay a lot of cost. Each time when we onboard someone, it takes time and extra effort on board that person. We have to pay communication costs, management costs, and coordination costs. So if there's more people, more teams, we have to coordinate them, and it's quite expensive. So on this diagram, as you can see, there is just onboarding cost. So our velocity is below the original one because that person just slowed down everyone. So another developer have to spend time with that new joiner to help them to understand the project, launching, and so on. But after that, we have also that extra cost, which I have mentioned about management, coordination, and so on. So our target is not the same as we have expected. So maybe you can do it another way. And so how? So of course, if you want to scale your product company, you have to start with organization. And then you can scale team, development, product. Of course, you can scale all of them or just one of them. So it's your decision, but you have to start with organization. But hopefully there's not a lot of to do. So first you have to just allocate extra time for that. So because you're not able to prepare or implement following action without that investment. And it's very important, it's not costing, just investment. So you just spend some money just now and you'll have huge benefits later. Of course, if it's implemented correctly, because sometimes you can just spend a lot of time and money and will have any pros. And what is quite difficult, what I have seen, to balance between new features and tech debt, because each project has tech debt. But very often we have temptation to implement just new feature and we don't have time to implement or solve tech debt. Okay, so first let's start with team, because that part is the most common way how we can scale company, because we can just add more people, more teams, but very often it doesn't work. And the biggest problem is just onboarding cost. So as we have started, I have mentioned that I have been new joiner more or less more than 50 times. So I have seen many problems, and now I want to share what I have observed. So something what you should be aware, new joiners aren't productive on the first day. So if you have short deadline, adding more developers just now doesn't solve your problem. Even just delay your time to market. So you can add, of course, if you have someone who is very experienced, know the domain topic and so on, it may work. But very often it doesn't work and even slow down development. A second part related with documentation, because that new joiner should become familiar with your product. So of course you can just invest time of your developer to teach them how to use the product, how it works and so on, but it's much better to use documentation. But of course there's many problems with documentation. Very often there's no documentation, it's outdated, but there are two other problems which are not they are very, very common, but people are not aware of that. So the first one, this documentation created by, for example, team which know everything about the project, but for new joiners it's quite difficult because there's a lot of vocabulary which they don't know about some part of the system which are just implemented. Everyone know about that, but for new joiners it's completely unknown part. So even if there's documentation, it might be quite difficult for new joiners to understand what is there. And the second one, the last one, which is very, very common, documentation is there, but it's somewhere. And there's no good structure and navigation between documentation. So let's assume you join to new company. There is documentation about something. They use different naming for that stuff. And now it's very difficult to find that documentation. I have seen many situations when there was very good documentation, but it was structured in terrible way that even development team haven't used that search engine to find the documentation, but they store links somewhere in the on their computer and just open them because it was too difficult to find documentation. And we have discussed about that. So there was a question: do you use that search engine? No, because it's terrible. So if you create documentation, it must be search table somehow, or and also should be navigate from one place to another. And the second one, complexity about your code base. So sometimes it's too big or too complex, and of course it's too complex. Then I have seen projects where new joiners need months to be onboarded, and after half year they become productive, more or less. And the next one, so there are two different approaches. Sometimes project management like to switch developers from one context to another, from one service to another, because they believe that a person can become familiar with entire system faster. And it's true for a very experienced developer. For a not so experienced developer, they become too overloaded. And so in my opinion, it's better just focus on something and after that switch to another context when they understand that part of the application. But of course, for very experienced developers, you can do that. The next one, team composition. So it's also obvious. So until now, there's quite obvious topics, but they are not implemented very often correctly. So we have to balance between seniors, junior, and regular developers. So I hope you have seen that pyramid before, but I have seen so many projects where there was only senior developers, and it's quite interesting solution but sometimes it works, but very often the senior developer discuss how to do something perfectly, and there's never-ending discussion about that. Instead, just provide value. So team with only senior developer sometimes work, but very often it's just a terrible idea. And but also I have seen teams when there was only one senior developer and, for example, 5-7 junior developers. And as you can imagine, that person was just overloaded with code review, with discussion, so there wasn't time to provide any value for your product. And so you have to balance between those levels. And the next one is everyone should be, so everyone, teams and people should be independent. But so everyone try to implement that, but maybe I have seen only a couple of companies where it was implemented correctly. So very often front-end developers wait for backend developers because they have to create backend, create API, and after that they can implement front-end implementation. We are going to discuss about that later, how we can just improve that part. But also many teams work on the same problem. So for example, there is like a DevOps team or infrastructure team just create infrastructure, and development team use that part. Or there's another team just create integration or just manage integration part, and then development team has to integrate with that integration team and so on. So, but there's a lot of bottlenecks quite often. Like for example, they have to wait for someone, they are blocked, and something what is not so obvious, accesses. So in some companies, developers have access to everything what they need. Of course, I know consequences is not very secure, and we are not able to implement everywhere. But in reality, you should trust somewhere. So, so if you can create an environment when developer at least has access to sandbox environment, when they can test the ideas, instead of ask someone to create grant them access or even not grant access, to configure it for them. So they are quite often blocked. So when you hear from your team that they are blocked, they are waiting, then definitely you won't be able to scale your company or your team. So, and solution is just very often create boundaries between team somewhere else, like to become more independent. Okay, so it was everything about development. So with those changes, you can just scale your company, your team a little better. I haven't provided ideas how to do it correctly, but I have highlighted problems, and they are very often. And the second way how we can scale your organization is not by adding more developers, because our goal, why we scale our company, because we want to achieve more and not increase cost a lot. So one of the options, of course, add more developers, more teams, but very often it doesn't work. But in my opinion, we can do something much better. So we don't have to hire more people, but we can become more productive. And that part, in my opinion, is more beneficial. So let's discuss about one problem. So someone joined to your company, and they have to manage and deal with components which are here. So there's a lot of relation between them. And then you ask your developer to work on one the component which is highlighted here. But as you can see, there's many relation to another services, another components, and so on. So it's very difficult to become familiar with such kind of code base. But if you just separate code base and create a different repository for each service, it's much easier to navigate the problem you have solved. And so now I want to discuss about monorepo versus multi-repo. So I had discussion about it quite often. Okay, maybe not quite often. So teams which use multi-repo never considered a migration to monorepo. There was no topic for them because it works perfectly, there is no problem. But teams which use monorepo, there was always every couple of months discussion if we should, and if we can, how long it will take to migrate to multi-repo. And also before this presentation, I have typed to Google discuss difference between monorepo, multi-repo, and there was a lot of arguments that monorepo is good because, for example, documentation is one place. Okay, it's one place, but it's huge, so it's a huge wall of text, and no one just can navigate that documentation. The second argument, code can be cleaner. Completely disagree, because if you can everything in one place, and then you can just connect component too easily, then codes become quite messy. And there was a lot of different arguments why monorepo is better, but in my opinion, there's only one valuable argument. Like you can easier modify multiple services. But let's discuss it later. And about multi-repo, there's a lot of benefits. So the pipeline is much faster. It's much easier for new joiners. You don't have any conflict when you just release new changes. So with monorepo, just people very often just freeze their code or just create logs because they want to test something. It should be stable. And in that meantime, no one should change the code base. So, but of course, so with monorepo, just people have such kind of problem, and they are going to have invention every time to solve them. Okay, you can just improve some of them, not all of them, but if you use different approach, you don't have to waste your time to improve something what was created by very often by your team. So, so if you can migrate to multi-repo, I just strongly recommend. But I mentioned there's one argument about for monorepo. So it's much easier to modify multiple services. And now that part will be more technical, but I'm going to explain it quite easier. In easy way. So on the left side, we have a repository with many domains. For now, I have only extracted two of them. So we have delivery domain, order domain. So two different modules, directories, whatever. And there's another module named API we just use a bit by those two services for communication. And now on the right side, we have infrastructure. So we just deploy two different services, delivery and order. And now there's a request to modify communication between delivery and order service. So developer can just very easily modify that API and then propagate changes to order and delivery service. It's quite easy. And after that, merge everything in one merge request. So until now, everything is fine. So we can apply changes to multiple services quite easily. But this one consequence of that. So even if you can modify multiple services at the same time, you have to deploy them somehow. And you're not able to deploy both of them in atomic way. So it means first you have to deploy the first service, and after that you can deploy the second service. Okay, you can trigger deployment at the same time, but you don't have but it's impossible to deploy exactly at the same time. So for a moment, there might be a situation that you have just newer delivery service which are not able to communicate with order service and so on. So it means with something like that, with that approach, when you can modify too easy multiple services, it just creates an illusion that you can do that. But after that, you have consequence of that change later. So after weeks when you decide to deploy your service to production, you have to pay that cost. So, okay, it's easier, but in my opinion, that's just monorepo create illusion of many different problems, which are quite difficult and quite costly to resolve later. And also, I completely agree and very often just use monorepo when I prototype something because it's just much faster. But when you have a mature product, that is the perfect way to complicate your scalability. So if you don't want to scale your company, is the best way. Okay, I have mentioned about pipeline. When you use multi-repo, you have fast pipelines, and it's the problem which I have seen quite often. So of course, that problem mostly appears. So if you have monorepo, you probably have slow pipeline. Of course, maybe your team just spent many weeks to improve it. Maybe you don't have unit tests or integration tests, and it's fast. But it's very, very likely that will be slow. So all monorepo projects which I have seen was slow. So pipeline was slow. But we need instant feedback because let's assume you just create merge request and after that your developer has to wait 1 hour. It's not joke. It's quite quite often. And I have seen many projects when developer had to wait 1 hour for to build the merge request. After that, they had to merge it. It was added to merge train, and after that, it was built again. So the same merge request was built 3 times, multiple 1 hour. So it's at least 3 hours. And what your developer can do in the meantime. Very often, just something else, like for example, switch context, which is quite expensive, check Facebook, and so on. So, and they are become not productive very often. So, if you can implement fast, instant pipeline, it's much better than a slow pipeline. And if you have a slow pipeline, so if you have any kind of pipeline, it becomes slower and slower. If you have even a fast pipeline, it will become slower eventually. But with multi-rep, it's much easier to control it. And something what you probably not aware, but the team is going to used to it. So if it's slower, like take 1 hour, they maybe just they complain now, but after a couple of weeks, months, they will just stop complaining about that because it become natural for them. And for that, new joiners are very helpful because they join, they see why it takes so long, they complain about that. And but after some time, also they are going to use to that situation. So yes, so for pipelines, it's very worth to hear new joiners because if they see problem, probably there's something wrong there. And the next problem related is releases. And in my opinion, developers just afraid to release application to production because it's risky. So it's much easier to implement something and merge the code base. If you have monorepo, the problem become bigger because now not only your team, but also another teams merge to the same repository. And when you have to release something, you are responsible not only for your changes, but also for another changes and changes from another team. You don't know what was there, if it's safe to deploy, and so on. So if you postpone releases, developers very often just accept it because it's quite convenient for them, and they just postpone that problem to later. But of course, the problem doesn't disappear. And also from your product perspective, you want to have instant feedback. You want to deploy applications so quickly as you can. So sometimes even a couple of days per day. So if you can do something to release application faster, if you can change your approach to deploy application faster, so faster, more frequent, it was very beneficial. The next one is design first. So I want to say that sometimes each task, each problem is just converted to task which is assigned to random developer, and they have to implement it. But maybe they're not the best person for that. Maybe they don't have experience with that, or even they don't see high-level picture. So because some problems has effect on another part of the system, or maybe at the same time you just work on another to extend your system, and that part will be just integrated. That problem will be integrated with something what you're going to implement in the future. So if someone with high-level picture can design that, or at least help design that part to avoid future refactoring, migration, and so on, then it's quite beneficial. So you don't have to implement all ticket, just this ticket and just implement. But sometimes you have to just, it's very beneficial to design it. Of course, I'm not suggest to implement waterflow mechanics where you have to design for ages and after start implementation. You can create very simple design in a couple of days. And even if you invest that days, you can save months or weeks of refactoring. But even you don't have to refactor. You can just design better because you can use another type of services, another type of integration, and just save weeks of development with a couple of days if you decide to design it first. The next part, so until now, as you can see, I touched many different topics, but everything is connected, but let's discuss it later. The second problem, core over the context. So each business has something named core, and something what is unique for your business. It's the reason why what is the reason why your customers decide to use your product instead of your competitors. And you should focus your effort on that core because, yes, it's beneficial. And this context. So context is something else what you have to implement, but it supports your product. Like, for example, authentication, invoices, and so on, but it's not core of your business. Of course, if you create system for invoices, then of course it's core of your business. But if you create some product and after that you have to generate invoices for your clients, then it's just context. So it depends. So, but the goal is you don't have to implement. So you have to convince your developers to focus on the core. They should be aware of that part of the system is the most important, and everything else is just should support your core. And for that, you should use existing component. You can buy existing component, and probably it's much cheaper, and there is less problems with such implementation than implement everything else. Sometimes even you can outsource that problem to somewhere else, because maybe they can implement it better. Maybe they have experience with authentication. So if you have to integrate your system with authentication service, you don't have to implement yourself. You don't have to configure yourself, because it might become quite tricky. And but maybe you can just ask another company to help you with integration. And of course, the business knowledge about your core is still in your hands, but something what is less important can be delegated to third parties. Then I have mentioned about context and core because very often for each product we have to implement API. And API is just a way for communication between different component services. And as I have mentioned before, probably you can guess it's the part of the context. So it should be implemented, it's needed, but you shouldn't spend a lot of effort to implement context. But very often, it's almost always, developers just to implement new feature, to implement new API, the life cycle looks like here. I'm going to focus on that front end and back end about REST API because this is the most common problem. Almost everyone has the same problem. And very often your development team implement in that such way. So implement some first backend team implement server, after that create merge request, review, merge it, deploy it somewhere, and after that front-end team start development. That pipeline, that flow can take days. Sometimes they create documentation, not always, but sometimes they can create documentation. And after that, front-end team discover something is wrong, something is missing, or maybe that API doesn't work as expected. And now there's request for change, and they have to implement everything. And now it's quite slow. They have to wait for API and so on. So that problem appears quite often. And there are some numbers. Of course, you don't have to focus on numbers, but I want to show some relation between them. So documentation is not very time consuming, but very often it's not implemented. You have to implement. So let's start from the bottom. Then you have to implement, actually integrate your API with your domain business code. You have to create some routes. So it's very technical stuff which have to be created to implement that API, and then you have to create that model for that routing. And it wouldn't be nice to reduce it only to less than half. And so the question is, if you can do it better, and in my opinion, definitely yes. Okay, it's not my opinion. I have done it many times for many companies, and it works perfectly. So how? So first we can design API, and then you can implement backend and frontend. So frontend team doesn't have to don't need to wait for backend team anymore. But design is not everything. We can test, but I'm not referring to test-driven development, but you can just challenge. You can go from one endpoint to another to check if everything is there. Front-end team can verify if they have enough information to display everything on the front-end application and so on. And that approach is named API first. So first we design, and after that we start implementation. But can we do it even better? And definitely yes, because if you use some kind of specification which is well documented, and there's some tooling for that, then you can generate a lot of code from specification. And after that, you have to only integrate that generated code with your backend, with your frontend, and you don't have to write documentation because that specification is documentation. You can generate developer portal from that documentation specification, so you can save a lot of time. And the second improvement, that design can be done by backend and frontend, or both of them. And once I have introduced that pattern many times for different companies, but once I have a presentation with such approach for the rest of the team. There was their CTO, and when they have finished presentation, they have mentioned that from today we are going to implement API first, because they have seen how beneficial it was. So we was able to create new endpoints, implement front and backend in a couple of hours than waste time on something what is not needed. And of course, for front end, I just recommend OpenAPI. But even if you use OpenAPI, you can use OpenAPI in good way, on better way. So it depends. So you can improve. So I have seen companies which can use OpenAPI, but there was some way to improve that to work even faster. So until now, I have touched many different components, and maybe you don't see relation between them, but it is. So when you start with a multi-repo, then you can just, you don't have problem with slow pipeline. So of course, with multi-repo, you can implement slow pipeline, but it's very likely that will be quite okay. It's much easier to onboard system. And if you create documentation before, and documentation is very often created by, maybe I can just highlight, it's very often created when you apply design first. So when you apply design first, you have documentation, but also you have less refactoring and so on. With multi-repo, as I mentioned, you can just easier onboard new developer, you have faster pipelines, and also you can just release application faster, because that repo is much smaller. You know your team, you know what was applied there, and the developer don't afraid to release the changes more frequent, because they know what is there, they know changes. And if you add some optimization, that it definitely help for that. If you apply API first and you have contracts, then it solves problem of releasing of two different services, because if you have contract and you provide some kind of backward compatibility or forward compatibility for your contracts, then there is no such huge risk with deployment. So and then you can just solve problem with blockers waiting when you have independent teams and API first or contract. So, but you don't have to apply all of them. You can just apply some of them, and it should be quite beneficial. And there was one more topic which I want to discuss, but maybe let's skip this one. Maybe you can discuss it later. And so until now we have discussed how to scale team. So it was one approach. We have discussed about the development lifecycle. And in my opinion, that approach is the most beneficial, because you can just increase your productivity, means achieve more with the same cost. Okay, maybe not the same cost, because you have to invest your development time to add some improvement, but after that your cost will be constant, and after some time they will be able to provide more. But of course there is another aspect which you can scale. You can scale your product. So it means you will be able to scale up and scale down, but it's not everything. Also should be able to scale down on in. So when you don't have so many requests or so many traffic, you should be able to reduce your cost, because yes, it's not you shouldn't waste a lot of cash on something what is not used. And that part, so what you can do to improve that scalability? So first, my recommendation is just use cloud provider and serverless. I know fintech doesn't like to use cloud providers, at least some companies for which I have worked in the past. But us is quite tricky, because when I have started cooperation with them, I have asked if you can use some kind of managed services or serverless approach. So something what we don't have to manage ourselves, to reduce development complexity and use just services which already exist? And very often the answer was no. So I tried to convince companies to use cloud providers like AWS, whatever. And very often the answer was no, because it's less secure and so on. But after many months, they decide to migrate the infrastructure to cloud provider. So what does it mean? So there are some limitations, but very often it's our internal limitation. We just limit ourselves from some reason, instead of consider if it's really the problem, because that managed services and everything provided by cloud provider is very often much more secure than managed by yourself, because they just apply updates and also security updates themselves, so we don't have to care about that. Also, they just audit all services. So everything what is on, for example, AWS, I'm going to use AWS, but the same you can apply for all of them. So all their services, or most of them, are just audited. They provide much better SLA than probably your team can provide. Also, they provide scalability for free, so you don't have to implement it yourself. You can just use it. It's also almost all of them has some kind of certification, or probably that certification which also your company needs. And the last reason, it just saves a lot of time. So you don't have to implement everything yourself. You don't have to manage the services, but you can focus your effort on development. And what services you can use? Of course, definitely API gateway. It's sometimes okay. You can use API gateway. You can use some kind of queues like SQS and so on. You can use also managed database, but also you can use day Kubernetes services. Of course, you can set up everything yourself, but the total cost eventually probably will be just much smaller using managed infrastructure than doing yourself, because when you're doing yourself, you have to pay for your developers to maintain it, to update, to moderate, and so on. And now you can just transfer that cost to a third-party company and just implement everything, just provide the value. So, but I'm aware that when you have huge infrastructure, that cost may become very, very huge. So you have to just consider. So in my opinion, just consider it as option. So. And something else what is related to the previous one, you don't have to build everything yourself. You can just use existing solution. I have mentioned about API gateway, ingress, identity providers. Identity providers is quite tricky, because I have seen very often just teams decided, okay, not very often, sometimes. In the past it was more common, but now it's hopefully not so common. Teams decide to implement their own identity provider instead of use something what is well tested, is secure. There's a lot of features, so I don't see any reason to implement it themselves. Also, I have seen companies which just implemented the development tools, deployment tools. Sorry, instead of use stuff like Helm chart, Terraform, just created everything themselves, maintain it, and after that, of course, everyone decide to migrate to something what is standard, but you shouldn't start with your own implementation. So, and the next one about where deploy your services. So now Kubernetes is just a standard for IT world, but still I see a lot of companies which just use their own services like JBoss. They deploy application to they manage, okay, not manage, to self-hosted services as Docker containers and so on. But yes, but with Kubernetes and with managed Kubernetes, we can just simplify that. So, and why it's important? Because everything what I have mentioned here can just scale up and scale down if it's needed. If you need more resources, just Kubernetes can orchestrate your infrastructure and create new hosts, new nodes if it's needed, and delete them later. So you can just scale your product and after that scale down. And everything else would the same. If you use managed services, with managed services you have scalability for free, mostly. But instead of that, you have to implement yourself. And the next one is about using the proper technology. So some companies has their own tech radars. Some of them just use external tech radars, but I against tech radars at all. It may, for me, tech radar is just a hint to what new is there, what might be interesting. But should your company rely on tech radar created by another company? That tech radar created by them is good for their problems for their developer, but it shouldn't be good for your company. So of course you can just check tech radars, existing tech radars for something for news, but still you should use the best technology for your problem. Also, almost everyone try to use SQL database, but I personally dislike such kind of database. It's a good database, but it's overused. There's so many different kinds of databases which can be scale up, scale down, solve problems in different ways. So we can just save your development time and can focus on something else instead of, for example, implement your problem on SQL database. And as there's many different solutions, so if you use, for example, Kubernetes, Kafka everywhere, then maybe using another kind of messaging platform for new kind of problem can be beneficial, because maybe they provide some kind of solution or option to which you don't have to manage or handle anymore with self-hosted services. So, and of course, there is that about program. It was on high level because each of you has different kind of problem, different kind of technology. But my goal is, if you can, please use managed services, because you can just solve a lot of problems. And it was everything from my side. So. And sorry, the last sentence. So if you want to build scalable services company, whatever, you don't need a lot of people. Sometimes you can scale your product with current team instead of just hire a new one. So as you can see, you can achieve the same goal with many different ways. So thank you. Maybe you have some question.
So much. That was really, really interesting. Do you have any questions? Everyone who attended, who was listening, do you have some questions?
Maybe you disagree with something, because I have touched some problems like multi-repo versus mono-repo. I have discussed it many, many times. And yeah, so.
Yes, please feel free to unmute yourself and share your opinion or ask your question.
Hi, here Pablo from Area 42. I'm a product owner, and yes, it was a bit technical to me. I must be honest about that. But it was very interesting because it can help me also to understand the way that the IT guys, are always trying to create this documentation, and should we generate it? Should we create it? By writing this parcel. It was quite interesting to see the different way of knowledge transmission also, that could help a lot for the scale up. And this is what this is my takeaway for this part, that the knowledge is the most important. Transparency is how can the information be transmitted to one team to another, and how they should be at the pyramid that you showed at the beginning was very interesting. So just want to say thank you, because it will help me a lot. Even though I'm not a technical guy, I'm product owner from the design part. So I also agree with this part. We need to start by just writing down what we are willing to do and how we're going to scale. It's easier than just being direct to the doing thing, the pipeline or whatever.
So in my opinion, documentation should be so close your service as is possible. So of course you shouldn't document everything there, but I very like to put some basic documentation in the README file of your product, of your service in the repository, because everyone can navigate it quite easily. And after that, if you have more sophisticated documentation, like for example, architecture diagrams, some documentation which is useful for deployment releases and so on, they should be created somewhere where you can navigate to that documentation. So some kind of links, because if it's somewhere and people don't know it's there, then it's just impossible sometimes to find that documentation. Yes, so, and also documentation should be created. So the second problem, use ubiquitous language, because very often developer team, product team use different language. And each time someone has to translate from one language to another, which is problematic, time consuming, and so on, creates some, it just creates problems. So if you can use the same language, define language first. And yes, what else we can do here? And also documentation should be readable, not only for people who has created the documentation, but also for people who is going to use that documentation. So
I see. I am to agree. I live in that every day.
me too.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Or any other feedback or anything?
I have a question. Lukasz, in your how do you see the main trend? Is the main trend in-house development or developing the product itself with external partners?
I think there is no trends, but you should apply whatever is beneficial for you. So I have mentioned about core versus context. So core system, in my opinion, should be implemented by your team. If you can, of course, implement it by your team. Of course, you can implement core of the system with support of external components. If you don't have knowledge about how to do it correctly, if you don't have experienced team, then it's beneficial to use help of someone else. So maybe you can just mix teams. So work at the same time with external company. We can train your developers, and after that, also your developer will have knowledge about the product. Very often teams are afraid about outsourcing because that company can disappear. But also have seen a lot of situations when it was implemented in-house and then development team just changed their job. So that knowledge also disappear. So I think there's no silver bullet how we can do that, but whatever is better for you. But definitely I recommend some kind of context. So if you don't have time to implement, let's say, integration with identity providers like Keycloak and so on, because identity provider can be very, very tricky, and implement it in the correct way can be quite problematic, time consuming. So if you can involve experts for that, and they can just implement, configure it in the secure way, because as I have seen a lot of applications, I have audited some applications, I have done some consultancy, and while the meeting with their team, I was able to discover that, for example, okay, they have used something, or maybe they thought they used something, they have illusion that application is secure, but while the meeting, I was able to send requests to their services and skip and authentication because it wasn't implemented or configured correctly. So, so some of the job integration task is worth to use experts for that than, for example, invent everything from scratch. So I think you have to balance, and this no the best way. Okay, whatever is better for you, not for, you shouldn't rely on trends.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions or any other feedback?
Hi. I just wanted to say that it was really interesting and supportive to my own beliefs, and I'm really believing what you are up to. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much. If you have any other question, okay. If not, don't forget that this presentation and the recording will be shared afterwards with everyone. It will be on the members portal, but also with everyone who attended the session, so you can re-see it, you can have another look, and then if you have any other questions, you can always send an email to me, so I can put you in contact with Lukáš for further questions or discussions. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Lukáš, for this very interesting presentation. And I really hope to see everyone in 2 weeks at the Digital Finance Summit, 6th of December at the Egg. And I wish you all a lovely day.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.